Hi, my name is Stephen Van Tassel. I'm a tutor at King's Evangelical Divinity School, and I wanted to talk a little bit about a tool for exegesis that I thought would be helpful for you, as it certainly has been helpful for me. To give you a little background, I learned this particular method when I was at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary when I studied and took a class under Dr. Scott Hafemann. The purpose of discourse analysis is to understand the logical relationships between the propositions of a particular passage. So what you are doing is that you are breaking down the passage of Scripture that you are looking at, and it's a section of Scripture, not so much a verse. You want to look in terms of a full segment of Scripture, for example, a pericope if you're talking about the Gospels, or an argument within Paul, or perhaps a narrative in the Old Testament, or an oracle if you're dealing with some of the prophetic poetry. And you are trying to understand how do these ideas relate to each other in the goal of looking for what is the key point that the author is trying to drive home, as well as discover the subpoints. And so basically you are outlining the passage, but trying to do it not from what you want the passage to say, but trying to understand the internal logic that the author is trying to portray. It is an extraordinarily powerful tool that can be very helpful in terms of how you can analyze a passage, and you don't even need to know Greek or Hebrew to do it. So what you're seeing here in the screen is basically the discourse analysis study tool, and what this does is it lists all of the various ways that two propositions relate to one another. And so it's basically broken down into two parts. The first three at the top are what's called coordinate propositions, and that is each proposition makes its own contribution to the overall argument. For example, if you tell your child, you may have a hamburger or a chocolate shake. Those are two separate propositions. It's an alternative, of course, but they stand by themselves. Each one is not subordinate to the other. They are basically two propositions offered evenly to the child that the child can then choose. And so that's what makes those two propositions coordinate. That is, both equally provide information to the overall point, that is, the parent giving a choice to the child. And you can see that option in number 3, where it's the alternative. So the first one is series, that is where it's just one thing after another. For example, here's one bowling ball pin, here is another bowling ball pin, bowling pin, excuse me, and here is another bowling pin. So those are 3 bowling pins in a row, and that's a series of statements. And then you can have what's called a progression. Think of it as a staircase where you are providing one point and then sort of adding on to it as if you were going through progressive staircase parallelism in Hebrew, for instance. So you would say, and he was Lord of his house, and then he was Lord of the village, and then he was Lord of the nation. So that would be sort of a progression, a series of statements that are all in coordinate relationship. That is, each one is simply standing by itself, but there's sort of a progress. It's toward a goal. And then, of course, I've already discussed the alternative option. Do you want a hamburger or do you want a chocolate shake? So again, so that is the first type of relationship between two propositions, that they are coordinate. And within a coordinate proposition option, you have 3 choices. You must select one. Okay? So, of course, we all know that there are plenty of propositions that are not coordinate. That is, they don't stand alone. Namely, one proposition supports or stands in a subordinate position to another proposition. And here we have the remaining options below. And so these are categorized into three major sections. The first one says that the second proposition restates at least part of the first proposition. The second section is that it's a distinct statement to the first proposition, or in the last section, that it's a contrary statement to the first proposition. So those are the three major categories for a subordinate clause. Now I know that I'm hitting you with a lot of information here, and this can seem very confusing. Trust me that once we start showing you how to use this in a particular passage, it will begin to make a lot more sense and you'll have some fun with it. Doesn't necessarily make it easy, but you will definitely understand this a little bit more. So I'm just going to highlight a few of these options here for you, and then we can try to get into the guts of a particular passage that I've selected for us to do. So you'll see in the first one we have here what's called a way end, and this is where there's an explicit method to do something. And for example, you go to Springfield, Massachusetts by driving a car. So the way to get to Springfield, Massachusetts is by the means or the way of driving a car. So it's an explicit method of how to get there. You must drive a car. So the end is Springfield, Massachusetts, and the way to Massachusetts, Springfield, Massachusetts, is by driving a car. The next subordinate type relationship we have is a comparison. He roared like a lion. Now you know that's also an ellipsis because the rest of the phrase would say he roared as a lion roars. So he roared would be your first proposition, and then like a lion roared would be the second proposition, and they would stand in a comparative relationship with one another. Negative positive is another way. In other words, just like when Paul says, do not do evil, but put on the life of Christ. So you have a negative statement followed by a positive statement. There you have a positive-negative relationship. And then you have a general specific. So you have a general rule, love your neighbor, and then Jesus provides a specific example of the Good Samaritan helping someone that he met on the road to Jericho. So then you have fact interpretation. Jesus is Lord would be the fact. The interpretation would be, therefore, whatever he says about our life, we must obey. That would be the interpretation. And so that covers our first set of subordinate relationships, but there's plenty more. The second section, as I've already mentioned, is distinct statement, and the first one is ground. Now normally, and notice how I'm going to pair ground with the next one, which is inference, and this is basically an ordering issue. If I say, go to your room because you disobeyed me, the because is the ground or the rationale for the statement, go to your room. That's the mirror image of the inference, which is because you disobeyed, therefore go to your room. So here they're basically mirror images of one another. So in the first one, the second clause supports the first clause as the ground. The second example that I gave is where the first clause actually provides the reason for the therefore in the second clause. And of course then we have the next option is cause and effect, which I think should be pretty obvious. I hit the ball and the ball took off. There's a cause effect. Conditional is if-then clauses. This is where you'd use a conditional phrase. Means end is where the second action is intended, and we might be able to find an example of those, but it's very similar to the way end. The way end is where the method is explicit. In the means end, the end is more explicit, so the goal. Then we have a temporal relationship. Of course, would occur in historical literature. Jesus went to Jericho, and then he went up to the Sea of Galilee. So the relationship between those two clauses would be time, or you could even take that as a locative, that there's a geographical relationship. And then the last set of comments, relationships between propositions, is the contrary statement. And this is where you have the adversative. This is a strong adversative, despite a contrary clause. It's not an option. It's do this, but not that. A question and answer is another relationship between clauses. And then finally, a situation response. So a person was caught cheating, and then he cried. So there was his response. So those are all the different ways that two propositions can relate to one another. And so in our next video, I want you to be sure that you have this printed out, and then when we go to our next video, we will actually discuss a specific passage of Scripture, and then we can analyze how we apply this to the interpretation of that passage. So we'll see you next video.